Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the HSC Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Women's History Month today. Today's event is titled Imposter Syndrome and its Impact on Professional Identity. My name is Dr. J.P. Sanchez. I serve as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor for DEI at the Health Sciences Center. On behalf of all of us at HSC Office of DEI and Vice President Dr. Romero Leggett, we'd like to thank you for making time to join us. For those who could not be here today, this presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. We will be using a Zoom webinar format that does not allow participants to address the panelists directly, but rather through the questions and answers function. The chat feature is not available. Please place your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try and address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. You can see panelists, but panelists cannot see you. And please also take a moment to complete the pre-assessment in the chat box that Amaris just provided. This will help us understand your interests and reflection during the month. With that, I would like to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Rebecca Van Vleck de Moss, who graduated pharmacy school in 2014. Currently, she's a staff pharmacist at Framarica Pharmacy and assistant adjunct faculty for our College of Pharmacy. Dr. Dominguez Salazar is an associate professor and the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Director at the University of New Mexico College of Pharmacy. She has co-pioneered many learner-centered academic programs that promote critical thinking within both the Doctor of Pharmacy and the Interprofessional Health Sciences programs. She has extensive training in motivational interviewing, relationship-centered communication, de-escalation training, and developing active learning curricula in the academic and practice settings. With that, please help me in welcoming Krista and Rebecca.
Thank you so much for that interaction. Yeah, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome and its impact on professional identity. This has become a topic that's near and dear to Dr. Salazar and my heart. So we truly hope you enjoy this, and we truly hope you're able to take this and learn and reflect, and hopefully it does make that impact on your professional identity. So defining imposter syndrome. Krista, do you want to do the next slide?
Did it work? Nope. Give me a second. There you go.
Oh, the learning objectives. Let's do the learning objectives first. So today we're going to define imposter syndrome and its impact on professional identity. We're going to summarize a systematic review for evaluating the evidence of imposter syndrome, connect personal stories to imposterism narratives for disrupting the power of silence, and discuss tools to mitigate and overcome the impact of imposter syndrome. So defining imposter syndrome really is, it can apply to anyone who isn't able to internalize their own success. This is people with imposter syndrome are aggressively pursuing achievement while not able to accept recognition when success is achieved. And so why are we going to be discussing imposter syndrome? Why has this become near and dear to our hearts? Well, what we're seeing is that persistent questions about our professional legitimacy always end up leading to a higher risk for diminished career retention and burnout. And as we've seen within this COVID-19 pandemic, burnout is a huge hot topic. And even within Dr. Salazar's and I's personal life, we have seen that those questions of legitimacy or that internal reflection that we're not able to internalize our own success has led us to that diminished career retention, that burnout, those overall negative feelings associated with imposter syndrome. So this is why we want to discuss it and bring it to the surface and put a name to it. And so when we were putting together this presentation, Krista and I have experienced this. But what is out there in terms of literature and true systematic reviews? And what we found is this particular systematic review was published in 2019. It accumulated 62 review articles from 1966 to 2018. And it looked at 14,000 individuals. And just like our purpose today, their purpose was to really find out of the prevalence, predictors, and treatment of imposter syndrome. And what was then interesting, so they published that in 2019. And as we moved into 2019 to 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And the authors noticed that there was a really big need for a commentary or a shortened, condensed reflection on what all that massive data that they accumulated from 2019. And so in response to that COVID-19 pandemic, they published this commentary in 2020. And they also included a national discussion regarding race and equality that they found from this commentary and from this systematic review. So we figured we would take just a few moments and break down what that commentary included in terms of true prevalence, incidence, treatments, and predictors. So the prevalence from this systematic review is 9 to 82%. And that's a pretty varied scale of the prevalence. Like, what do we do with that? And what's interesting is the authors did kind of note why there's that potential for such a range of prevalence. And it can boil down to recruitment strategy. This was a population-based and primarily in students. So that could be a reason for this range in prevalence. And also there's two different screening tools. There's the Clance imposter syndrome and also the Harvey imposter syndrome. That could potentially be leading to that range. They also commented on the cutoff used to assess the symptoms. And not just the cutoff, they were only primarily looking for positive symptoms. So if a trial or a study is only looking for a positive outcome, of course, you're only going to get positive assessments, right? And then they also noted the potential for publication bias. 16 articles found that imposter syndrome was associated in a higher among women versus 17 of those, 62. So 17 of those 62 articles found no effect. And also they mentioned who were studied. So previously the recruitment strategy was based on students, but they also further broke it down into potential for age, potential for race. And what's interesting about age is the sex and age. 60% of the women within those 62, 60% were women. And the mean age of all of those systematic reviews was 20. And so that's a pretty young group and primarily women. So that could lead to that range in prevalence. And also when we talk about age, what's interesting is 2 studies reported that as we get older, imposter syndrome or the prevalence of imposter syndrome decreases, yet 3 studies found no effect. So that's all to say that that's a lot, and there's a lot of potential people to be experiencing imposter syndrome. So it's really hard to pinpoint the true prevalence based on what the authors were saying. So moving on to the individuals who are at risk, I think you went backwards. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. So when we talk about prevalence, we saw a huge range of prevalence, right? But what about who's at risk? So we know that it's pretty prevalent, but what about the risk factors? And really what the authors pinpointed was individuals who have more responsibility and less supervision. So more autonomy, less supervision, have an increased risk of imposter syndrome. And if we think about it for a moment, who is that population? That population are leaders. And I would venture to say all 39 of you on this presentation have experienced some sort of that lateral or increased move in our professions or personal life where we are having more autonomy and less supervision. So I encourage you to start reflecting, did that occur in my life? And did I start experiencing these symptoms? And what the authors also wanted to mention is that increased organizational support, if you're finding those lateral or increased moves within your profession, that increased organizational support really ameliorates that. And also, because this was during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, they were identifying that the reduced workforce led to what they coined as survivor's guilt. And that was another interesting breakthrough in imposter syndrome, that people were not just experiencing this as a professional issue, but they were experiencing it when they saw all their coworkers pass away, or they found all their family members have passed away due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the survivor's guilt pushed individuals for feeling, why me? Why was I the one to live? And those persistent questions led to imposter syndrome, and then contributed to that overall burnout we saw in healthcare and still see today. And then speaking of the commentators mentioned that national equality, and they wanted to touch on the minority student populations. And although only 11 out of the 62 peer-reviewed trials included race or mentioned race, it is interesting to point out that the African, Asian, Latino, and Latina American college students have a documented risk that's higher for experiencing imposter syndrome. And what they wanted to mention was the lack of financial aid, the need to work to support themselves financially, of course, the systemic racial discrimination, and being first in their families to pursue an advanced education, all led to that specific population, the minority students, having an increased risk of developing imposter syndrome. But I also, go ahead, Krista.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to go on to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
So I wanted to add to this, that I'm looking at this slide, and it is what is reflected in the study. So that's what our slide reflects. But I'm looking and I'm thinking, what ethnic group is missing that we also know experience this? And we're missing our Native population.
Yeah.
So
I know that the commentators did mention that this is an area that we need to open for more study, more discussion, just at a bare minimum. And not only that, there's a whole population of group, the Indigenous individuals, that's missing from the 62 peer reviewed, but even 11 out of the 62 only included a discussion on race. So this whole area of our minority student population and how their particular lifestyle, their background, who they are, what makes them who they are, needs to be included and studied as potential risk factors, and how to ameliorate this for that particular population.
Yeah.
And so that kind of leads us to the next slide.
I want to add real quickly about the COVID-19 pandemic. The survivor guilt was also related to those that were able to keep their jobs, because a lot of people were losing their jobs, being laid off for various reasons. And so there was that survivor guilt of, why me? Why was I the one to get to keep my job? And then that imposter syndrome began to creep in there as well.
Great point. It's not just about loss of life, but loss of job as well.
Right.
Great point. And so moving in from that minority population, we also see that there's the environment or institutional discrimination that can occur. So it's not just with minority individuals of color, but we can also see that with women in STEM or international students of the American universities. What the authors really wanted to highlight was, if an individual cannot see themselves in that environment or have that sense of belonging, that as a woman or as a international student, as a minority, if they can't see themselves being a part of that environment, that's when imposter syndrome can take hold. And also, they identified potential behavioral and family causes as additional risk factors. I'm sorry, this was not part of the systematic review. These were what we were taking from this as what we were seeing. And so I do want to correct that. But what we were also seeing is that family and behavioral causes. So in true childhood memories or childhood traumas, that the grades were never good enough, or the siblings were outshining. We can make a whole presentation on family and behavioral causes that can contribute to imposter syndrome, but that definitely is specific risk factors that one can experience to increase risk of imposter syndrome. and also the personality types. We all know that type A personality that is always striving for perfection. And when we talk about perfection, it's their perceived idea of what perfect is or how to achieve perfection. And that interim or that space, if they're not achieving what they feel is perfect for specifically for a type A, you can see how those questions of illegitimacy can occur. And if we never reach that perfection, that's when we're going to experience the imposter syndrome. So those are the particular risk factors that we've identified. And also, just to kind of end the literature and data heavy part of this presentation, of those 62 peer-reviewed articles that were published in 2019, half of those were done in the past 7 years. And so to us, that really highlighted how this is being talked about. It's being experienced. And we may not have the name for it, but it is becoming more and more prevalent. And since it's been within the past 7 years, we wonder what's going to be the future and what's coming. And we do know that more is coming. But this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. Whether we talk about COVID-19 or not, this has been with us. And we want to highlight it, we want to identify it, and we want to encourage us to get and how to overcome this, right?
Right.
So we're not going to do this today, but Krista is going to be posting the test in the chat, although I'm not sure if the chat function is disabled. If
She is able to post in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. So we encourage you guys after the presentation or at some point soon after this that you do this Clance imposter test. It's only about 20 questions. It should take you about 5 minutes or so. And it really goes through various questions and gets you thinking about how are you experiencing imposter syndrome? Have you experienced it? And it's a wonderful quick test to get a snapshot of how you're feeling, whether professionally or personally. And then what you'll do is each of the questions has a 1 through 5, and you'll circle those or get your calculator out. And then at the end, you'll tally and total all of the 20 questions to see what your score is.
So I'm not able to cut and paste the URL just yet, but at the end, I definitely will do that when I end because I have to take it out of presentation phase.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And then, so here's just a look at the first page of what you'll see in terms of the 1 through 5 scoring.
Yeah.
And so once you're done, this is the score interpretation. So there's 4 different ranges. 40 or less, you have few imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon characteristics. 41 to 60, you have moderate. 60 to 80 are frequent, and 80 and above is intense imposter experiences that potentially interferes with the person's life. And so what we started thinking about after giving this presentation, and even after the both of us have taken this test, we started thinking about those ranges. So 40 to 60, I believe. So 40 to 60, you have few to moderate. And then 60 to 80, you have frequent or intense. And we started thinking about how does that translate to what we've experienced? And I think what we've decided is you can experience imposter syndrome, or we wanted to start calling it as a phenomena. And when you start thinking about the difference between a syndrome versus a phenomena, it's transient. So those who have moderate or few are just experiencing it. You can have a fleeting moment or an interaction or a discussion in your mind when it comes and you start feeling those symptoms. Versus individuals with 60 or even 80 or greater, they're actually living in imposter phenomena or imposter syndrome. So take that moment as a quiet reflection after you get your score and really see if how this fits within your personal and professional life. And what's also interesting is that I wanted to point out when I specifically took this test for the first time, I was with Dr. Salazar. And I believe I scored, I think around like a 40, 38, something like that. And then I turned around and we gave the presentation to my coworkers. And in front of my director, I believe I scored like a 72, which is a good few points difference. And I wanted to highlight that because that highlights the phenomena idea behind this, that we can experience it on different levels in different environments. And as I previously spoke, environments is key as a risk factor. So the environment with Dr. Salazar potentially is more inviting, and I see myself with her and it's more comforting and is more of a mentor-like relationship versus being in front of my director. Oh my gosh, she's my boss. I don't know if I'm ever going to meet her standards. You can see how those different environments can increase those risks for feeling of imposter syndrome. So please do take that moment and take that reflection when you do take the test and see where you fit.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I want you all to just reflect on these terms: imposter syndrome, imposterism, fraud syndrome, perceived fraudulence, imposter experience, imposter phenomenon, however way we want to refer to it. It's an internal experience that its very nature leads to isolation through pluralistic or ignorance. That is the quality of the phenomenon that is most intriguing to me, because together we are individually and privately doubting ourselves. No one talks about it, and so we maintain thinking we're alone. And since it's not tough to know how hard any one person really works at something or how they doubt themselves, the opportunity to skillfully and develop strategies and tactics to successfully dismiss feelings, it gets stymied in our isolation. A person who experiences imposter syndrome is not at all an imposter. And instead of standing tall on the branch that is ours for taking flight, we feel vulnerable and we feel isolated. And I believe that we do that because personal success is tethered to facets that make our individuality. And yet society defines success as a tidied up shiny box that may not reflect at all what is tethered to us. And that thing that tethers that to us is as unique as our individual fingerprint. Imposterism is incredibly personal, and it carries our stories with it. And for me, it began at birth, being born to a mom who was 16. That couldn't have been easy for her. And I know it wasn't easy for me growing up. And if I fast forward to arriving in academia as an assistant professor and a pharmacist clinician spearheading a new curriculum, that became a slurry of complexity resulting in what I call living in imposter syndrome. I lived in it for over a decade. And to help you imagine the complexity, consider the made up prototype of a pharmacist, of a professor. And then consider me, the person that you see sitting right before you in this video. Consider me, the Hispanic female, the first generation high school college graduate, first generation terminal degree graduate, first associate professor in my family, first pharmacist clinician in my family, and then being a pharmacist clinician has its other things tied up. Many people don't know what pharmacist clinician is, even in the healthcare field. And so when I took the test, the assessment for imposter syndrome, and I saw my whopping score of 92, it brought me to my knees. But then I stood back up and I began to explore in a curious sense, rather than in a shameful sense, of how do I define success? What is that facet that makes me shine inside and out? How does my success overlay with my institution's definition for success? And what gives me a sense of belonging within my own success? What makes me excited to get up in the morning in a genuine and authentic way? And how can I keep growing well? Well, in a way that supports my mental, emotional, and physical health. And part of what added to the complexity of me living in imposter syndrome was not just the makeup of who I am culturally or what my familial background is, but who I am personally. And I was brought up from the age of 4 doing art, and it was an integral part of who I was. And when I came to pharmacy school, I began to unintentionally, I didn't recognize it, but upon reflection, I recognized it. I hid a huge aspect of myself, which is that I'm an artist. And I get emotional even sharing it and talking about it, because I remember in my mind thinking art is dumb. It's not smart. It's not intelligent. It's not important, particularly compared to the sciences, which I now know couldn't be far from the truth, but that was the lens that I was looking through when my lens was coded in imposterism. And so that's my story about imposterism. Each of our stories are incredibly unique. And I encourage each and every one of you to begin to explore that for yourself. Rebecca did that too, and she is going to share her story of imposterism or imposter phenomenon or syndrome, whichever you want to call it. Rebecca, you're up.
So I had a wonderful opportunity. Well, it was an experience regarding the transdermal fentanyl, and this particular experience put a patient's life at risk. And the whole moment, at the end of that moment and at the end of that interaction, my coworker turned to me and said, "You should make a presentation regarding what happened." And what was happening was the inappropriate use of transdermal fentanyl. And the transdermal fentanyl is a very potent opiate narcotic that cannot be used for opiate naive patients, which means that they've never been on any form of pain medication. And what we were finding is there's this increased pattern of providers providing it to these opiate naive patients. So I felt really strong because it was a very, very powerful interaction where I had to communicate with this provider and really at the end of the day save their life. And because of that, I did create this presentation, and the New Mexico Pharmacists Association was the first the first organization that I was able to present this to. And it was so well received that it just blew up. I ended up doing a blog. I ended up being on a podcast. And then it even went to 2 different national CEs. And I tell this story not to boast. I tell this story because throughout that whole process, imposter syndrome kept creeping in. And each success came those internal questions of why me? And not only why me, but it was also who the heck am I to talk about this very in-depth opiate mathematical calculations. I'm not a pain specialist. I'm not an opiate specialist. I'm just a retail pharmacist. I'm just a long-term care pharmacist. And not only that, I believe this was before the pandemic. So I'd only been practicing pharmacy for maybe 5 years, which is a lot, but also not at the same time. So you can see how that wonderful process of success, I was not able to internalize it until Dr. Salazar and I really started talking about this and really starting to reflect on the internal narrative that was so negative and so not accepting and just inhibitory for me doing more. Even though I kept doing more, I still kept saying, really? Am I the right person to do this? And at the end of all of that, I believe I was able to educate over 14,000 people. And when I really start to think about that impact, that fuels me for more. versus before this, I think I would have been inhibited and scared and still questioning why me. So that's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rebecca. And I think what I love most about the contrast of our two stories is it, and not that any one story compares, because it's so individual, we can't begin to compare. But what we can begin to do is ground ourselves in seeing how imposter syndrome can really begin at the root of who we are at various places in our lives, or maybe at the beginning. And so, and it can wax and it can wane and it can get better and it can seem to disappear, or it can get worse at different places in our lives, wherever that success catches us.
But what we're hoping by the end of this presentation, like you said, it waxes and wanes and different pieces of our life can come and go. But hopefully by the end of this presentation, what we've been able to work on, what we're going to show you on how to overcome, you too can begin to work on that.
Yeah. And so we asked this very simple, just yes, no question. Do you experience imposter syndrome? Even before you've taken the assessment, do you imagine you experience it? And the assessment can begin to help you conceptualize where you're at in it, but it doesn't tell you all about where you're at in it. Because one thing I encourage you all is to begin to listen to yourselves, ask those questions constructively to explore your lens that you're looking through life from. And so what we're going to move into is strategies and tactics for reducing imposter syndrome, because once we've identified that we're there, it's important to begin to do the work to move us from there. And here are a list of items that I have found in the compilation of research. And one of the biggest ones is to put a name to it, which is exactly what we're doing today. A name to it that I believe is more powerful to call it an imposter phenomenon rather than a syndrome, because it's not an integral part of who we are as much as it feels like it is. It's not. Everybody experiences it, just as in Rebecca's summary. And in celebration of Women's Month this month, women are not more prone to it than men are, but it is a systemic a systemic phenomenon that really contributes to it. So it's not the nature of being a woman that would make us more likely to experience it. Another way to reduce the impact of imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Talk about it with mentors, talk about it with people that you trust, people that you can be honest with and real with, and people that will call you out when they suspect you're not being real with yourself. It's really important to do that. Remembering what we do well. It's not a matter of being falsely positive, but it's just simply remembering what we do well. Each and every one of us has talents and abilities that are unique to us, and remembering that is important. Learning how to see mistakes as opportunities. And this is a really important way to battle that perfectionism that prevents our ability to reduce the impact of imposter syndrome. So learning how to see mistakes as opportunities is key. Changing your thinking to a growth mindset. Reconceptualizing that negative self-talk into positive self-talk, and positive self-talk that is grounded in truth, not just positive for the sake of being positive. Being a committed lifelong learner, which every single one of us in healthcare are, and many of us have taken an oath to do just that. And then just doing it, just owning our success, which is what Rebecca really highlighted in her story, and thoughtfully working through those concerns, being comfortable with being uncomfortable in your space of success. So what we're going to move into now is talking about what was individually helpful for us, because some of the things on this list at the space that we're at in the imposter phenomenon in our own individual spectrum, we may not be able to use these things effectively. But as we develop and better understand the syndrome that is all our own, these tools can be helpful. So Rebecca, you're going to share with us what was not helpful first and then what was helpful.
So what was not helpful was really two really big things that I identified. The first was having forceful or angry management tactics that were more critical criticism than constructive criticism. And I point that out because once you identify what is not helpful, you can kind of guide how you manage yourself and how you manage your team. And so I've tried to work with individuals and trying to highlight, hey, can you rephrase or how you approach that constructive criticism to better help me understand what I need to do better. And then the other process I found that was not helpful was all of the family and friends doting on me. So throughout that whole fentanyl presentation series, they were like, this is so good. You're doing so good. You deserve this. I'm so happy for you. And when I started questioning myself, they would say the same things because that's what they do. They're trying to be supportive. But in my negative narrative mind, all I heard was, that's what they're going to do because they love me. They're not going to give me the true harsh criticism because they're my family or my friends. And whether or not that's true because they just felt that they had to or not, I doubt that's true because they want to be honest. But you see, it's still there. It's still present as a negative narrative in my mind. Mm-hmm. What I did find helpful was that personal reflection. And what ended up breaking me from that negative imposter syndrome cycle is when I really sat down and reflected about the amount of time that I put in. Doesn't matter if I'm an opiate specialist or if I'm a clinician or on the other spectrum that I'm a staff pharmacist. What matters is I put in the time and my heart into that presentation. Mm-hmm. And that's where I get my knowledge from. And that really broke that cycle that I can do this. I did do this. I can do more. And this is why. So I don't necessarily need to have all the titles and all the credentials and whatnot. It's about the time and the love that you put in that makes it important. And then I also started to try and adopt the daily self-reflecting. I learned this when I was a resident at the VA. I try and identify 3 things that I did well that day or in that interaction, and I try and do the 3 things that I can improve on. And I changed that phrase because a lot of people say, what did you do wrong? Or what did you do bad? It's not black and white. It's what can you improve upon? So simply changing some of those adjectives and verbs and how you're talking to yourself really does have an overarching benefit in the pattern of experiencing and overcoming imposter syndrome. And also, I know Dr. Salazar mentioned that growth mindset. There's a fixed versus growth. And I really do feel like right now my trajectory has been in the growth mindset where I crave feedback. And I want to just do and listen, and I want to do better and become better. But you have to be in that growth mindset to accept that feedback in a positive and not critical way. What about you, Krista?
Yeah, so for me, the things that were not personally useful were very similar to you. It was any sort of supportive friends that would tell me the good work that I'm doing. They would say nice things about me. I just figured, oh, they're my friends. They have to say those types of things. And then when it came to, as faculty, student feedback or peer feedback, it was interesting because whether I got positive feedback or negative feedback, both of them were just personally not useful. The positive feedback, it just seemed unimportant and it didn't seem to have any sort of luster, any sort of importance in my mind. And then that negative feedback was so weighty to the point where I couldn't even think clearly when I saw it. And so those were things that were personally not useful for me. Doesn't mean that they're not useful for me now because I've developed differently. And what developed me differently was what was personally useful. And so what you'll end up seeing is you'll see this cycle of this thing that was not personally useful at first. Once you're able to identify something that is personally useful, to be able to create a different lens for you to look through, you can then revisit, and the things that were not once personally useful become useful. And the thing that I begin to stem or build my foundation from is I am a lifelong learner. That is a way that I identify. And that helped to guide me into changing my thinking, developing a mindset that negative self-talk has no purpose, that it's not going to contribute to my growth. I begin to, what I call, become a recovering perfectionist. I will be that for the rest of my life. And I begin to see mistakes as opportunities rather than condemnation about me. And I begin to meditate on those things that I'm doing well and how I can do better, rather than seeing them highlighted as mistakes and horrible things about myself. I began even writing down things that I thought and quoting myself. And I wrote a quote here that I'd like to share with you all. And it's that humans make mistakes. Hold your own human experience of mistake making long enough to engage transformation, and charitable enough to thrive in its life-giving breath. And so another thing that was so helpful for me was journaling and reading the notes that I wrote and seeing that positive reflection that I had. It helped to build self-awareness, not only based on taking my personal strengths in the Clifton Gallup Strengths Finders, but also personal strengths that I was able to identify in myself. I did talk about it with mentors, and I talked about it with people that really could relate to me because they could see me more clearly. And so mentoring was something that helped me drastically once I was able to find a mentor that I felt I could trust and that I could relate to. So I want to give us all a summary of imposter syndrome and what we've talked about over these last 45 minutes. It was first described in 1978, but it's been on the rise over the past 7 years. It's important to know that imposter syndrome is not a disease. It's not an abnormality. It's not a psychiatric disorder. And it's established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations. So there is no gender, no race, no age, no occupation, no particular group that is more likely to have this beyond structures that aren't working in our favor. It is more prevalent, and it does disproportionately affect underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. But it's because of that tidy box that society ties things up in, and it creates a reflection that we don't see ourselves in. And so it's important to begin to look at that. Imposter syndrome is not tied to necessarily personality type, but it can be. It is not necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem, though. And to really call it a syndrome, it downplays how universal it is. So beginning to think of it as a phenomenon, something that is a human experience. And it's a human experience that its very nature gives us the feeling that we don't belong, that others are going to discover we're a fraud, that we don't deserve our job or our accomplishments. And so here we are today talking about reducing the impact of imposter syndrome, because we see that ideas, whether we talk about them in informal or formal ways of mentoring through sips and chats or ideas exchange or other ideas that some of you may have, we know that the literature tells us that increased organizational support is going to ameliorate imposter syndrome. Not only ameliorate it for you and for me, but for our students, for our colleagues, and it will impact the world. And so Rebecca and we are incredibly passionate about bringing this out into discussion, because from the literature, we know discussing it, bringing it out from hiding is going to help ameliorate it as well. We're hoping to create a professional development series and workshops. We can do this within your own classrooms in your particular programs within the Health Sciences Center, or we can do this as interprofessional education. But these are some topics we've thought of. You might think of some topics on your own, and we'd love for you to put them in the chat or in the question box so we can begin to collect them. But some items for ideas that we've thought of are learning how to receive feedback and how to give feedback, e-professionalism, how to overcome from imposter syndrome so that we can begin to see it as a phenomenon, meaning we can learn to reconceptualize personal narratives and develop strengths-based learning. And this is particularly important in DEAI specific related topics as well. So we want to know your imposter phenomenon story. We'd love for you to contact us either by email or telephone, and maybe we can even have a one-on-one visit and learn more about each of you, because this is how we begin to impact it, is pulling in our personal stories, helping people see that they're not alone. When people see that those of us in leadership experience this, they're more likely to talk about it. And when we talk about it, we're less likely to live in it. And when we do experience it rather than live in it, it becomes more transient rather than feeling as if it's a nature of our own.
Well, and I also think that there's a level of being authentic. And why we tell our stories and we're so open, like we don't really even know you, but here we are bearing our souls. And we want to be authentic and we want to be true and we want to enable all of you to do the same, because you never know who's experiencing and wanting to keep it so closed off that when you become your true authentic self, they can see that through you. And then hopefully together overcome whatever they are experiencing or whatever you are experiencing. So we're hoping that we're showing that to you all and opening this door to want to truly help. So please utilize our emails, whatever we can do to help. And if you have feedback for us, if you have ideas on how to better this presentation or more ideas for that workshop, we're all ears.
Yeah, I think sharing with the audience right now the nature of our relationship is relevant. And I don't think we shared that at the beginning. And so Rebecca was a student of mine, about a decade ago now? It's not quite yet.
Not quite yet. One more year, because you taught the first year and I started pharmacy school in 2010.
Okay.
Oh, so then it was a decade in 2020. I don't know.
Yeah. So about a decade ago. So she was my student. And then we ran into each other again, and she began helping me in a class that I teach. And so this is where I opened up to her about my experience with imposter syndrome and the similar hearts that we are. She wanted to know more about this. And the more I shared with her, the more I began to heal from it. And then it began to create healing, or what you like to call overcoming, in you, Rebecca. So I think that that's relevant and significant to share with the audience.
Well, and what's relevant is you're my mentor. And so we're able to develop these ideas together in a true, like, this is happening to us and it has happened. And so we want to speak truthfully.
Yeah.
So is it time to open for questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Krista and Rebecca. So we have a couple of questions. One of our participants asked, regarding the data that you presented at the beginning of the presentation, do any of the articles or data include the LGBTQ plus perspective? Was there any discussion in the studies about queer and trans folks specifically?
So I actually, during the presentation, had a moment to look at the actual trial. And no, they did not touch on the LGBTQ plus group minority. And to my knowledge, can you attest? Oh, Chris is going.
I'm here. I'm still here.
But to my knowledge, I do not believe I know it did not include the Q plus group. And I'm not sure that has even been studied in the Q plus group. But it would be amazing to work with that very specific population and to try and identify. I'm almost positive that it is occurring, especially with the potential for gender dysmorphia and the trials that are occurring right now. And so we don't have true hardcore data, but I don't necessarily think we even need it to know that that population is at risk and does experience it.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, Rebecca. And what we see is marginalized populations in general are more at risk because our society doesn't reflect those individuals as clearly as it could. And so absolutely, I think that there could be a risk, and that needs to be talked about more openly as well. I recently read a book by Zena Sharman. It was called The Care We Dream Of. And it was about an individual who shared their experience as a trans person. And I want to read a quote of Zena's, and it's, "All bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strength and needs that must be met. All are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them." And it was something that this person had written about, and I could just imagine in the bodies that we're in, we question the very nature of our importance and what it is that we have to put out in the world. Just one more thing that she wrote here that I want to read. It says, "Queer and trans people are alchemists. We are mysterious, impressive, inexplicable, and powerful. We are skilled in the art of transformation." And so those things that Zena is declaring are not being seen or expressed in the world. And so it needs to be recognized, needs to be seen. So thank you so much for that question.
And I think the next question was about, how do you account for imposter syndrome that develops due to mistreatment and abuse in the workplace, rather than how the individual feels about themselves? And I think I can definitely attest to this one because I've been in two different places in my life where the direct supervisor and colleagues have been very negative and toxic. And I think the biggest piece of advice that I still don't follow, but if I were to say, do as I say, not as I do, is to really focus on your own strengths. You have to be that person that supports yourself, because at the end of the day, you only have yourself. And if you're constantly relying on external support or external validation, that's where you get whipped up in that, tornado of imposter syndrome. But the moment you step back and truly believe your own strengths and what you do and what you have achieved, whether in life or in that particular area or environment, that's where no one can be negative and impact you negatively. And I actually just recently had someone tell me that all they hear is whining, and that they also said that my technicians are smarter than me. And fortunately, through this work that I've been doing with Krista, that did not get me down whatsoever. It hurt and it was very toxic, but me, 7 years ago, that would have destroyed me. And the one thing that I know was different is knowing who I am, what I have done, and how I've accomplished in my own terms, not anyone else's, but truly my own words, my own heart, my own terms. What about you, Krista? Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I definitely want to add to what you're saying. And what I'm thinking to myself is we are individual and we are community. It's both and. It's
Yeah.
not either or. And so as much as we have that individual work that we must do, we do have to do that individual work. There is no working around that. And we need each other. And so we need to begin to build those spaces of support. I know there's amazing mentoring programs here at UNM, making those more available, more accessible, more openly advertised to be accessible to all people. Definitely there's individual work that needs to be done. There's systems work that needs to be done. And we've got to start where we can make the biggest impact.
Yeah.
And I truly do believe that that biggest impact is with us individually because we're with ourselves all of the time. And so finding that support so that you can build that within you, and just knowing you're not alone. And I know that not all bodies have access to that thinking or equal access to that mentoring. And so we really need to work to building that up for all bodies.
Well, and let us be mentors for those that do not. And this is once again why we put our contact information, because both of us do know the value of mentorship. And like I said, without Krista, I would not have been able to, I wouldn't be where I am today, number one. Number two, wouldn't be able to overcome the toxic, negative environments that I have been in. So please, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I think we're out of time, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Help me in thanking Krista and Rebecca for a phenomenal presentation. They've extended themselves to meet with you all around this topic as well. And also, please take a moment to complete our post-session assessment so that we can hear feedback about all of our events for Women's History Month. Take care, everyone.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, Amaris.
Hey, Amaris, just real quick. Do you have another second?
Yes.
How will we be able to get the feedback that's given in those questionnaires? Are they like feedback on the presentation or just the overall?
It's just the Q&A. You can get the printout of the Q&A if you'd like.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You guys
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye.